In the bitter winter of 304 AD, within the Roman city of Emerita Augusta, today known as Mérida, Spain, the marble halls of justice echoed with the steady footsteps of a child walking toward her own death. She was only 13, yet her resolve was unshakable. This was no ordinary execution, and she was no ordinary girl. Her name was Eulalia, a child whose courage would echo through centuries. In an age when empires silenced faith with fire and steel, she stood unshaken. The world remembers kings and conquerors, but this story belongs to a 13-year-old girl whose final breath defied the might of Rome itself. On that day, the full fury of the Roman Empire, the most powerful force the ancient world had ever known, descended upon a single fragile soul. Yet within that small frame burned something greater than fear: conviction. 13 torches were lit, one for every year she had lived, each flame a cruel reflection of her innocence and her defiance. And as we step into this moment frozen in history, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there as we revisit the fire that turned a young girl's suffering into an immortal symbol of faith? But within this act of cruelty, something extraordinary happened. Something that would reverberate across centuries, unsettling an empire and inspiring generations of believers. To understand Eulalia's story, one must first understand the storm that consumed Rome in the early 4th century. Emperor Diocletian, a man who had risen from obscurity to command the vast Roman world, found his empire cracking beneath the weight of chaos. Barbarian tribes pressed at the borders, the economy faltered, and political strife gnawed at the empire's core. In his desperation to restore Rome's fading glory, Diocletian became convinced that the empire's decline stemmed from abandoning the gods who had once blessed it. And at the center of his suspicion stood a rapidly growing faith, Christianity, whose followers refused to honor the Roman gods or bow before the emperor's divine image. To Diocletian, these Christians were not simply dissenters. They were a spiritual contagion threatening the soul of Rome itself. On February 24, 303 AD, the emperor issued his infamous edict, the first blow in what would become known as the Great Persecution. Churches were to be reduced to rubble, sacred texts burned, and Christian property seized. Government officials, soldiers, and citizens alike were forced to choose: sacrifice to the Roman gods or lose everything: their positions, their homes, their lives. The decree spread like wildfire through the empire, reaching Emerita Augusta, the shining capital of Lusitania, a city famed for its grandeur. Founded by Emperor Augustus himself, the city boasted towering temples, an amphitheater that held 15,000 spectators, intricate mosaics, and luxurious public baths fed by majestic aqueducts. It was a jewel of Roman civilization, glittering with wealth, power, and pride. And yet, beneath this surface of marble and order, something quietly subversive was taking root. Among the aristocracy and merchants, Christianity had begun to spread, whispered from servant to master, shared in hidden gatherings where bread and wine replaced sacrifice and incense. Into this paradoxical world, Roman opulence and Christian secrecy, Eulalia was born around 290 AD. Her family was wealthy, educated, and secretly devoted to the forbidden faith. Historical accounts, particularly the poet Prudentius, writing a century later, describe a household balancing privilege with peril, where her parents risked everything to nurture their daughter's faith. They taught her not only the words of Virgil and Homer, but also the sacred scriptures of a persecuted God. From this upbringing emerged a child of astonishing conviction. Ancient records describe Eulalia as brilliant, passionate, and fearless, a girl whose faith burned brighter than her regard for her own safety. While others her age learned to conceal their beliefs, she refused to hide. She would challenge Roman rituals openly, mock the idols of the gods, and speak boldly of Christ even when silence could have saved her. Her parents, terrified by her defiance, tried to contain her fervor, urging her to pray quietly, to serve the poor, to wait for better times. But when Diocletian's edict reached Emerita Augusta in the spring of 303, fear gripped the Christian community. Many fled to the countryside, some pretended to renounce their faith while secretly keeping it alive, and a few, like Eulalia, prepared themselves for martyrdom. The city's governor, Dacian, as the tradition names him, carried out the emperor's orders with cold precision. Churches were destroyed, Christian leaders arrested, and every citizen required to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. Failure meant torture or death. Certificates of compliance became the new currency of survival. To protect their daughter, Eulalia's parents fled to their villa in the countryside, hoping the isolation of olive groves and vineyards would shield her from danger. There, they believed, she could pray in peace until the persecution passed, as persecutions often did. But they underestimated the will of a child whose faith had already outgrown her fear. To Eulalia, hiding was not faith, it was betrayal. While her fellow Christians suffered and died, she could not bear the safety of her silk sheets and warm hearth. For days, she fasted and prayed, wrestling with a decision that few adults could comprehend: the choice to surrender her life for what she believed eternal. Then, one cold December night, as the villa slept beneath a pale moon, Eulalia slipped away. With her was one companion, Julia, a servant girl or perhaps a friend of equal faith. Together, the two made their way toward the city, their small figures moving through the frost-bitten fields as dawn began to stain the sky over the Roman temples. What followed would shake the conscience of an empire. Upon reaching the Forum, Eulalia did not hide. She marched straight into the heart of imperial authority, demanding to face Governor Dacian himself. When brought before him, this 13-year-old girl, slight, fragile, and radiant with defiance, began to speak. Her voice carried across the marble square like a storm. She denounced the Roman gods as demons, called their temples houses of lies, and accused the emperor of serving Satan. She mocked Jupiter as an adulterer and tyrant, and condemned the cult of the emperor as blasphemy against heaven. The crowd that had gathered, amused at first by what seemed like childish rebellion, soon fell silent, realizing this was no spectacle. This was a declaration of war, not with swords but with faith. Governor Dacian's reaction, preserved in the writings of early chroniclers, reveals the unsettling tension within Rome's persecution. He did not immediately order her death. Instead, he tried to reason with her, invoking her youth, her beauty, her family's privilege. He promised her safety, rewards, even honor, if she would only bow her head before the gods. But Eulalia's spirit remained unbroken, her eyes steady with the fire of conviction that no threat could extinguish. And in that moment, a fragile child standing before an empire, history witnessed something greater than rebellion. It witnessed faith in its purest, most terrifying form. The governor offered her everything a young girl could dream of: a noble marriage, wealth, and lifelong comfort, if only she would perform the sacrifice Rome demanded. Some chroniclers even claim he softened his tone, suggesting she need only pretend. A pinch of incense, a few whispered words, spoken without meaning. A gesture, not a conviction, the kind of compromise that had spared many lives before hers. But Eulalia's response shattered any illusion of an easy end. Before the assembled crowd, she strode to the altar, struck it down with her hand, scattered the incense, and spat upon the emperor's image. In that moment, a child had committed what Roman law deemed unforgivable, open sacrilege against the state and its gods. The act demanded death, and yet, Governor Dacian hesitated. The execution of a noble child was no simple matter. To kill her risked not only political backlash but the creation of something far more dangerous than rebellion: a martyr. So he delayed. Eulalia was thrown into prison, a cold, airless cell beneath the Forum, its walls dripping with filth and fear. He likely hoped that a night in darkness, with chains biting her wrists, would frighten her into submission. Perhaps her parents would intervene with bribes, or she would awaken to regret. But that night, something else unfolded. According to early Christian writings, she did not weep or beg. Instead, her voice filled the prison, praying, singing hymns, her words echoing through the corridors. Her faith, rather than breaking, grew sharper, defiant. Other prisoners heard her and drew strength. The guards, unnerved, whispered that there was something unnatural in her calm. By morning, her story had spread like wildfire through Emerita Augusta. Crowds poured into the forum to witness the fate of the girl who defied Rome. Governor Dacian now faced a dilemma that every tyrant eventually meets: to release her and appear weak, or to kill her and immortalize her. The ancient accounts differ in detail, but they all agree on what came next: a spectacle of torment that would scar Roman memory. Dacian ordered her torture until she recanted, subjecting a child to punishments reserved for hardened criminals. The tradition speaks of 13 tortures, one for each year of her life. Whether symbolic or real, the cruelty remains staggering. The flogging came first. Leather whips tore into her back, then iron-tipped scourges that peeled flesh from bone. The air filled with the crack of lashes and the stench of blood. But instead of cries, the forum heard something far more disturbing: hymns. Between blows, Eulalia prayed, her lips moving in praise rather than pain. The executioners faltered, confused, shaken by a power they could not comprehend. The torture intensified. Iron hooks raked her sides. Flames licked at her wounds. Witnesses said the smell of burning flesh hung over the forum like a curse. Yet each new act of cruelty only deepened her defiance. Some claimed she mocked her tormentors. "Is this the best your gods can do?" While others said her face grew serene, her voice unwavering as she whispered prayers through the agony. Boiling oil and molten lead were poured onto her torn flesh, tortures reserved for traitors and rebellious slaves, never for a child. It was as though Rome itself had lost its sanity. The crowd, once eager for spectacle, grew silent. Women wept openly. Soldiers turned away. The mighty empire, in all its power, seemed small beside this girl who would not yield. At last, exhausted and humiliated, Dacian paused the torture. Some say he gave her one final chance to save herself, hoping mercy might succeed where pain had failed. But Eulalia, bloodied and trembling, spoke words that would echo through centuries. She proclaimed the weakness of earthly rulers, the futility of their violence, and the eternal victory of faith. She spoke of resurrection, of life beyond pain, of a kingdom not built by force, but by love and sacrifice. It was the inversion of everything Rome believed in: power, pride, and fear. Her words were a quiet revolution, and Dacian knew it. His patience snapped. The final order was given. A pyre was built in the center of the forum. The flames would silence her voice and erase her defiance, or so they thought. As the fire roared around her, the legend says a white dove rose from her mouth, her soul ascending in visible light. Then, as her body burned, snow began to fall from a cloudless sky. A shroud of purity covering the ashes of the child Rome could not break. But even in death, Eulalia defied her captors. Christians risked their lives to retrieve her body, burying her in secret and honoring her with prayers and flowers despite the governor's orders. Within days, her story spread, whispered by travelers, retold by priests, sung in secret gatherings. She became a symbol, not of death, but of endurance. Governor Dacian may have reported a successful execution, the removal of a dangerous agitator. But in truth, he had failed utterly. Eulalia's death lit a fire that the empire could not extinguish. She became the rallying cry for a faith that refused to die, proof that even a child could shake an empire by refusing to kneel. And the greatest irony of all? Within a decade of her death, Rome itself would fall to the very faith it tried to destroy. The empire that burned a child for her god would one day raise crosses in her honor, not as instruments of torture, but as symbols of triumph. In the year 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued what would become one of the most transformative decrees in human history, the Edict of Milan. With it, Christianity, once a hunted and persecuted faith, was granted the right to exist openly within the Roman Empire. And by 380 AD, that same faith would rise to become the empire's official religion. The very gods for whom young Eulalia had been tortured and executed would soon be forsaken, their once mighty temples reduced to hollow ruins or repurposed into Christian sanctuaries. The governor who condemned her would fade into history as little more than a footnote, remembered only as a villain in sacred legend, while the child he martyred would be elevated for centuries as a saint, with basilicas raised in her honor and her feast day celebrated across Christendom. The cult of Saint Eulalia that emerged in the centuries following her death reveals something profound about early Christianity: its unique ability to turn pain into power, to transform suffering into a sacred force. The basilica constructed over her tomb in Mérida became one of the most revered pilgrimage sites in all Hispania, attracting believers from across Europe who came seeking healing, strength, and inspiration. The poet Prudentius, writing in the late 4th century, immortalized her in verse, his hymn to Eulalia echoing through churches for more than a millennium. Artists of every age depicted her surrounded by the very instruments that had once brought her torment, now transformed into symbols of triumph. The iron hooks that tore her flesh came to represent the unbreakable steel of her faith. The flames that consumed her body became eternal fire, the divine love that no empire could extinguish. Her veneration spread far beyond her native land. From Barcelona to Bordeaux, churches bore her name, each adapting her legend to their own needs and circumstances. To Christians enduring persecution, she stood as the embodiment of courage in the face of tyranny. To young women, she was the image of purity and steadfast resolve. To theologians, her suffering raised eternal questions about the nature of pain, the freedom of the will, and the justice of God. The growing number of traditions surrounding her, including disputes over whether there were 2 Eulalias or 1, and conflicting accounts of her tortures, did not signify confusion, but the organic evolution of myth into meaning. It was through these retellings that a historical child became a timeless archetype. As Christianity entered the medieval world, Eulalia's story was woven into the greater narrative of faith's victory over paganism. The Mozarabic Christians of Islamic Spain clung to her legend as a mirror of their own struggles, finding in her the courage to resist religious oppression. By the 9th century, her influence had even shaped the earliest forms of French literature. The Sequence of Saint Eulalia, a poetic testament to how her tale transcended mere devotion and became part of Europe's cultural DNA. Centuries later, crusaders would invoke her name before battle, believing that her defiance of Rome mirrored their own holy cause. Each generation saw something of themselves in Eulalia, each reshaping her story as a reflection of their hopes, their fears, and their faith. During the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church renewed its veneration of virgin martyrs like Eulalia, wielding their purity and devotion as powerful symbols against Protestant reform. Baroque artists rendered her martyrdom with breathtaking emotion, not just as history, but as divine propaganda, a vivid portrayal of faith conquering reason and tradition prevailing over rebellion. Jesuit missionaries carried her story across oceans, teaching that her youthful courage embodied the very spirit of total devotion they sought to awaken in others. Yet even as her story served religious institutions, it retained something deeply human: the power to inspire individuals grappling with their own crises of belief. Modern archaeology in Mérida has since uncovered physical traces that confirm the essence of her legend. The remains of the forum where she was likely executed, the cell where she might have been imprisoned, and the sacred continuity of her burial site, venerated since the 4th century. Layer upon layer of construction over her tomb, from humble grave to majestic basilica, tells a story not only of a martyr, but of a community binding itself together through shared memory and faith. These discoveries remind us that beneath the miracles and embellishments lies a historical truth. The contrast between what truly happened to Eulalia and what legend made of her opens profound questions about the boundary between fact and faith. Modern historians can separate the probable: a young Christian executed in Mérida during the Diocletianic persecutions, From the symbolic, the 13 tortures, the descending dove, the divine snow. Yet to dismiss those elements entirely would be to miss the deeper truth they carry. They reflect how early Christians understood suffering as something to be redeemed, not feared. Eulalia's enduring power lies not in the precision of the facts, but in the resonance of her spirit. She stands for every soul who has ever chosen principle over comfort, conscience over survival. She embodies the courage of every child forced to face adult cruelty, every innocent who has dared to defy power regardless of the cost. That she was only 13 makes her story even more haunting, a stark reminder of humanity's failure to protect innocence, and of innocence's strange ability to transform even death into victory. Her execution represented the collapse of every system meant to safeguard the vulnerable: family, law, morality. Yet her memory became proof that even in a world ruled by violence, the human spirit could not be crushed. In the 20th century, feminist scholars revisited her story, uncovering dimensions long overlooked. They saw in Eulalia's defiance a radical act of female agency, a child challenging the authority of men, from her father to the governor himself. By rejecting marriage and motherhood for a higher calling, she broke the boundaries of womanhood in a patriarchal age. Some researchers even noted the underlying sexual violence in the ancient accounts of her torture, interpreting her martyrdom as both a spiritual and gendered rebellion against male power. These readings do not strip her story of faith. They enrich it, revealing layers of human struggle still relevant today. From a psychological perspective, Eulalia's resolve seems unsettling to modern eyes. A young girl who courted death rather than bend to compromise. Contemporary analysis might diagnose religious fanaticism or extreme idealism, but such views risk detaching her from her time. In her world, dying for faith was not madness, it was meaning itself. When compared with other virgin martyrs like Agnes, Cecilia, Agatha, or Lucy, Eulalia's tale stands apart. Each of these saints defied marriage, endured torture, and died for their belief. Yet Eulalia's extreme youth and the horrific symmetry of her 13 tortures for 13 years made her story singularly tragic. It crystallized the image of innocence crushed by empire, and somehow, through that destruction, triumphant. Through centuries of art, poetry, and devotion, her image has never faded. Each portrayal, from medieval carvings to Baroque paintings, reveals not only the evolution of artistic style, but of the human understanding of suffering, sanctity, and strength. Eulalia's legacy endures as a mirror, reflecting back to us the eternal truth that even the smallest voice, when lifted by conviction, can echo through history long after empires fall. Early medieval art portrayed her as a mature, regal woman. Crowned in victory, her suffering softened, her triumph emphasized. Yet as the Gothic era dawned, the tone shifted. Artists began to capture her as younger, more fragile, and deeply human. Her serenity remained, even in torment, but now the viewer could sense her vulnerability. By the time the Baroque period arrived, depictions of Eulalia reached their most haunting and emotional peak. Paintings showed a child's body contorted in agony, her blood mingling with tears under dramatic shafts of light. Compositions carefully designed to evoke both awe and sorrow, to pierce the viewer's conscience as much as their eyes. In contrast, modern artists have grown hesitant to revisit her story in its raw form. Many either avoid the subject entirely or reinterpret it through abstraction, perhaps a reflection of our discomfort with sanctifying a child's suffering, no matter how sacred the cause behind it. The liturgical traditions tied to Eulalia's feast day on December 10th still preserve echoes of ancient devotion, linking the modern believer with centuries of unbroken reverence. In Mérida, her festival blends faith with festivity. Processions wind through the streets, old hymns rise again, and loaves of blessed bread are shared among the people in her name. These rituals are far more than nostalgic remembrance. They are living acts of unity, reaffirming communal identity across time. Their endurance through wars, reforms, and social upheavals shows just how deeply her story has rooted itself in the memory and heart of the city. Even those who no longer practice religion still see Eulalia as an inseparable part of Mérida's spirit. For centuries, theologians have wrestled with the moral and spiritual paradoxes surrounding her martyrdom. Why would a divine being allow or even will the torture of a child? How can divine justice coexist with the suffering of the innocent? And what does it signify that the miraculous signs, the dove, the falling snow, appeared only after her death, not before it? These questions have never had simple answers. Every Christian tradition has found its own lens to interpret them. Liberation theologians see in Eulalia's agony the image of a God who suffers alongside the oppressed rather than rescuing them outright. Traditional theologians focus on the redemptive beauty of suffering, the glory born of sacrifice. Mystics, on the other hand, interpret her story as a pathway to divine union through shared pain. Each reading mirrors the preoccupations of its age, reflecting shifting ideas about justice, faith, and compassion. During the colonial era, Eulalia's story traveled across the Atlantic, woven into the missionary efforts of the Spanish Empire. In the Americas, her legend gained new shades of meaning amid cultural collision. Missionaries invoked her as an example of steadfast belief, urging indigenous converts to renounce their ancestral faiths, sometimes with tragic results, as young believers faced rejection or violence from their own communities. Yet in Mexico and Peru, her image transformed again. Through a process of spiritual blending, she merged with local traditions, her feast absorbing indigenous symbols that would have shocked both pagan Romans and early Christians alike. This cultural translation revealed something profound: the universality of her themes, courage, sacrifice, resistance to oppression, yet also their adaptability to each culture's unique heart and history. The 19th century, with its romantic fascination for medieval saints, revived interest in Eulalia once more. Victorian poets and painters portrayed her as the embodiment of innocence destroyed by masculine cruelty, an image that spoke more to their own anxieties about purity, sexuality, and fragility than to the brutal reality of 4th century persecution. Her story became sentimentalized, yet still magnetic. The popularity of the name Eulalia among Catholic families during that era reflected how her tale was softened and integrated into ideals of virtuous femininity. And even in these domesticated versions, the echo of her original defiance, her courage in the face of empire, still stirred something deep within the human conscience. Her legacy resurfaced again during the Spanish Civil War, when both sides claimed her as their own. To the nationalists, Eulalia symbolized the eternal soul of Catholic Spain standing firm against atheistic revolution. To the Republicans, she was recast as an emblem of innocence crushed by fascist violence. The sanctuaries dedicated to her were desecrated, then rebuilt, mirroring the fractures and restorations of the nation itself. That both sides could see themselves in her demonstrates the paradoxical power of martyrdom narratives. They can sanctify rebellion or justify order, embody freedom or obedience, depending on who tells the story. The reforms of the Second Vatican Council brought fresh scrutiny to the cults of saints. Many ancient martyrdoms were re-examined, some exposed as legends. Eulalia, however, emerged from that review largely intact. Her story grounded enough in early sources to affirm her historicity. Still, the Church's new emphasis shifted away from the graphic spectacle of torture toward the moral beauty of witness. In modern Catholic teaching, Eulalia is celebrated less as a victim and more as a symbol of unwavering faith and divine courage. Recent hagiographies reflect this evolution. They emphasize her purity of heart over her physical suffering, aligning with contemporary sensitivities that reject the glorification of pain. The focus has turned toward God's love rather than the endurance of agony, a transformation that mirrors the moral growth of the faith itself. In our modern age, Eulalia's story resonates beyond theology. It has become a touchstone for discussions of human rights, children's protection, and freedom of belief. Advocacy groups working against religious persecution have invoked her name, but with caution, emphasizing the dignity of conviction without romanticizing martyrdom. Her story forces us to confront difficult questions. How do we honor youthful faith while acknowledging vulnerability? How do we respect belief without enabling suffering? Eulalia's narrative doesn't provide easy answers, but it does present these questions in their rawest form. In the digital age, her story has found new life. Online communities dedicated to her share prayers, artwork, and accounts of perceived miracles. Video games and graphic novels reinterpret her legend through contemporary storytelling, sometimes provocatively, sometimes reverently. On social media, her name circulates not just as an object of worship, but as a topic of discussion, critique, and reinvention. Her story now belongs to everyone, to artists, scholars, believers, and skeptics alike. The medical study of martyrdom has added another perspective, cold, clinical, yet illuminating. Modern anatomy and forensic knowledge reveal what those ancient tortures would have truly done to a child's body. This unflinching analysis strips away centuries of romanticism, confronting us with the unbearable physical truth. Some researchers suggest that the sheer brutality described in the accounts would have caused shock and unconsciousness long before the final stages, meaning parts of her ordeal were likely symbolic or exaggerated. But even this scientific demystification cannot erase the horror of what was inflicted upon her. Instead, it deepens our understanding of how trauma is transformed into memory and how faith reshapes pain into meaning. Viewed through a comparative religious lens, Eulalia's martyrdom stands within a larger human pattern. Across faiths, Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, there are parallel stories of young souls choosing death over surrender, conscience over conformity. The cultural details differ, yet the same eternal struggle persists. The collision between moral conviction and state power, between faith and fear. In every tradition, the victim becomes a beacon of defiance, a vessel of remembrance. Even the physical world around Eulalia offers clues to her time. The environmental history of Mérida reveals a city under immense strain. Plagues, climatic shifts, and economic decay had fostered an atmosphere of fear and instability. In such a setting, scapegoating and religious persecution became almost inevitable. Her death, then, was not an isolated act of cruelty but the product of a civilization cracking under its own weight. And so, her story endures not only as a chronicle of faith, but as a reflection of the human condition itself. Across centuries and continents, Saint Eulalia continues to remind us that the line between cruelty and conviction, faith and fanaticism, remains as thin and haunting as ever. The Christians' refusal to join public rituals meant to restore divine favor made them easy targets in an empire desperate for stability. Eulalia's execution, then, cannot be seen merely as a case of religious persecution. It was a symptom of deeper social unrest, where faith differences became a vessel for anxieties about cultural collapse and imperial decay. Literary studies of the earliest accounts of her martyrdom reveal a deliberate shaping of her legend, carefully woven within the familiar framework of martyr narratives. The fearless virgin defying authority, the mounting tortures, the miraculous interventions, and the ultimate conversion of witnesses, each element a familiar echo across numerous early Christian tales. This doesn't mean Eulalia's story was invented, but rather that real suffering was molded by literary form, giving structure and meaning to chaos. Recognizing these conventions allows us to peel back layers of embellishment, uncovering the historical truth beneath, while understanding how such stories helped early Christians interpret pain and build shared identity from persecution. The philosophical dilemmas her story raises still pierce modern conscience. Is anything truly worth dying for? And more haunting still, could anything ever justify a child's death? The modern West recoils instinctively, answering no to the second question, sanctifying the preservation of children as an absolute moral law. Yet Eulalia's defiance unsettles that certainty, implying that for some, conviction might still outweigh the instinct to survive. This isn't a call to glorify child martyrdom, but a mirror showing us how deeply our cultural hierarchies of value differ from those of the ancient world. To understand her world fully, one must see that other eras have defined virtue, innocence, and duty through radically different moral lenses, and only by recognizing this can genuine dialogue across civilizations exist. The economic realities surrounding martyr cults like Eulalia's open another dimension to her story. The grand basilica erected over her resting place transformed Mérida into a thriving pilgrimage center, drawing travelers who filled local inns, markets, and workshops. Relics, painted icons, hymnals, and devotional texts became sources of both livelihood and worship. This interplay between piety and profit did not dilute devotion. Rather, it anchored it within the tangible structures of medieval society. The endurance of Eulalia's veneration, surviving centuries of economic shifts, shows that while wealth played its role, faith ran deeper than commerce. Modern neuroscience adds yet another layer of interpretation. Descriptions of Eulalia's calm amidst torture, her unflinching serenity, her ecstatic speech, her apparent indifference to pain, align with what we now understand as altered states of consciousness under extreme stress. A surge of adrenaline, the flood of endorphins, and the clarity of unshakable belief could together produce genuine euphoria, even anesthesia. This physiological insight doesn't negate her faith. Instead, it intertwines the spiritual and the biological, suggesting that what witnesses perceived as divine might also have been the human body's most mysterious resilience. To them, the miraculous was simply the only language available to describe what they saw. Politically, Eulalia's defiance carried revolutionary weight. By refusing to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, she did more than reject a ritual. She rejected Rome's very foundation, where faith and empire were one. Her defiance was both spiritual rebellion and political mutiny, a small act that shook the sacred hierarchy of power. When Christianity later triumphed and turned its martyrs into saints, history inverted itself. The persecuted became rulers, the condemned became judges. This transformation forces an uncomfortable reflection. How resistance, once sanctified, can curdle into authority, and how faith itself can be tainted by the very power it once opposed. Gender adds its own tension to Eulalia's tale. Feminist readings note that her virginity often overshadows her faith, that purity became her defining virtue. The implicit threat of sexual violence lingers beneath many accounts, underscoring how patriarchal narratives equated female defiance with sexual danger. Eulalia, at once child and woman, innocent yet unyielding, embodies the paradox of female sanctity, revered for her moral strength, yet confined by it. Her veneration both celebrated women's spiritual autonomy and reinforced the limits imposed upon them, mirroring the contradictions within societies that praised virtue but feared female power. Even ecology finds a place in her narrative. 4th century Mérida's fortunes were tied to agriculture strained by climate change and resource depletion. As the Roman economy faltered and nature's balance failed, desperation sought scapegoats. Christians, who refused to partake in fertility rituals and seasonal offerings, became convenient culprits. In this light, Eulalia's execution was not just a clash of faiths but of worldviews, one seeking to appease nature, the other to transcend it. Her death, then, becomes part of an ancient struggle over how humanity understands its duty to the earth, a struggle still unresolved in our age of ecological crisis. As Eulalia's story nears its end, the question becomes unbearably intimate. What does it mean for a 13-year-old girl to choose death over denial? Psychology might diagnose idealism, indoctrination, or impaired judgment. Yet to dismiss her choice entirely is to deny the moral gravity that young souls sometimes possess, the capacity to see truth with clarity that adults, dulled by compromise, have lost. Perhaps the hardest truth is that Eulalia knew exactly what she was doing, and did it with full awareness. A decision that forces us to confront the possibility that some values, however uncomfortable, truly transcend life itself. Her story still speaks to us, echoing across the centuries and into our own age. Even today, In places like the Uyghur camps of China or the hidden churches of North Korea, faith continues to collide with tyranny. The same moral tensions remain alive. How do we defend our beliefs without falling into fanaticism? How do we protect innocence while respecting freedom of thought? Eulalia's ancient defiance illuminates these questions, reminding us that the struggle between conscience and coercion is as old as civilization itself. Her enduring legacy also reveals something deeper about how humanity heals. The transformation of execution grounds into sacred shrines, of suffering into sanctity, of victims into saints. It's both cathartic and cautionary. Remembering pain can give it meaning, but it can also risk romanticizing it. Eulalia's story challenges us to walk that delicate line, to remember without glorifying, to honor without idolizing suffering. And from the ashes of her torment rises an image that has haunted imaginations for centuries. A white dove ascending through the smoke, innocence reborn, pain transfigured. Whether legend or truth, it captures our timeless yearning to believe that even in agony, something pure survives, that from darkness, light can still emerge. So what do you think? Was Eulalia's vision a final illusion of comfort, or a glimpse into something beyond this world? Proof that even death can be transformed into meaning? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections keep history alive. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where every day we uncover forgotten legends, hidden faiths, and the haunting beauty buried within humanity's past. Because some stories aren't just history, they're mirrors showing us who we are and who we still might become.